Hey everybody, it's Devops Mike, and today we're going to talk about Kubernetes, specifically the kubectl and k3d command line utilities, and how they can make your lives easier when working with multiple clusters. K3d. K3d is an amazing command line tool for managing local Kubernetes clusters. It's super easy to get a brand new cluster up and running on your workstation in seconds. Kubectl, well, it's the de facto command line tool for interacting with your Kubernetes cluster. It communicates with Kubernetes control plane using the Kubernetes API. Now, you'll hear different pronunciations for this in the wild. You'll hear kubectl, kubectl, kubectl. These all mean the same thing, so don't worry. All right, let's head over to a terminal. Started with some Kubernetes clusters. We're going to go ahead and use the k3d command line utility. So if I do k3d -help, I see what commands and options are available to me. Now let's see if I've got any clusters hanging out here. Cluster list, not info. K3 cluster list, no clusters. All right, let's create a cluster. So k3d cluster create, let's create a QA cluster. So there we go. We're going ahead and creating a brand new QA cluster. We're starting some nodes on this new cluster, and we should be up and running in just a second. There we are. So now I do a k3d cluster list, and I see my QA cluster. So let's go ahead and create a prod cluster. So we've got multiple clusters to work with later on. We're starting nodes. We're starting our last node here. And we're done. So k3d cluster list now will show me my prod and my QA clusters. Now that we've got our clusters created, let's go ahead and wire up kubectl with the kubeconfig for QA cluster. Now I am going to leverage k3d to generate a kubeconfig file for the QA cluster. So k3d kubeconfig get QA, that will show me the kubeconfig file for the QA cluster. Now, kubectl has a couple ways you can wire up the kubeconfig. One of them is placing the kubeconfig in a .kube directory off of the home directory. So let's go ahead and do that. So here's my command. I'm going to do my k3d kubeconfig get QA, and I'm going to send that to the .kube directory off of my home directory in a file called config. So let's see, before I do that, if I do kubectl get nodes, you can see I can't talk to my cluster, right? So now let's do k3d kubeconfig get QA, put it into that config file. And now if I kubectl get nodes, there we go. Now I'm able to talk to my cluster. So this is a great way to interact with a single cluster. Now in our case, we've got a QA and a prod cluster, but we've only got a single config file that we have to work with. So let's take a look at another method of doing this. Now before we go any further, let's go ahead and get into our kube directory, and let's rename config to QA so that we know exactly which config that's for. And then let's go ahead and create a kubectl config file for our prod cluster. So k3d kubeconfig get prod, and we're going to send that to prod since we're already in the .kube directory. All right, so now I've got a prod and a QA config file. Now that probably broke kubectl, so kubectl get nodes. Yep, I can't point to anything. So now let's look at the second method for wiring up kubeconfig and kubectl. and that's using the kubeconfig environment variable. So we're going to set that environment variable to the location of our QA kubeconfig. So we're going to do that. And if I do kubectl get nodes, it doesn't work. Now, kube control sometimes gets a little finicky and you need to source your shell again. If I do that, kubectl get nodes, there we go. So now you can see I am pointing to my QA cluster. Now if I change kubeconfig to point to the prod cluster and I do kubectl get nodes, now you can see I'm pointing to the prod cluster. At the last method of wiring up kubeconfig and kubecontrol, and that's using the -- kubeconfig flag. Before we do that, I got rid of the kubeconfig environment variable, and if we do kubecontrol get nodes, you can tell we're not able to talk to anything. And if we go to our .kube directory, you can see we still got our prod and our QA kubeconfig files. So now if I say kubectl get nodes and I say kubeconfig is equal to the QA kubeconfig, there we go. I'm able to see now my QA cluster. And if I change that to prod, now I'm able to see my prod cluster. Now, a handy feature for this is creating kubecontrol aliases that are specific to your environment. So I could create an alias called k-qa, and that is equal to kubectl kubeconfig equals home/.kube/QA. So anytime I run k-qa, it is wired up the kubeconfig to point to QA. So now if I do kqa get nodes, it's pointing to my QA cluster. Now let's go ahead and create a prod version of this. So kprod is equal to kubecontrol with the -- kubeconfig pointing to my prod config. So now k-prod get nodes gets me my prod cluster. And this is a real safe way of interacting with your Kubernetes clusters. You know that you're not going to accidentally take action on a production cluster because your command specifies the cluster that you'll be using. Now that we've talked about all the different ways to wire up your kubeconfig and kubecontrol, I feel like it's still a little clunky. It's a little difficult to switch between your prod cluster and your QA cluster. Now the aliases with kubeconfig, that was handy, that was good. But sometimes you'll have many more clusters to work with, and you don't want to have to remember which alias points to which cluster. So let's take a look at Crew, which is a plugin manager for kubectl. Now, if you don't have that on a Mac, you just brew install Crew, and that allows me to install plugins. So kubectl crew list will show me what plugins I've got. I don't have any right now, so let's install some. So we're going to install the NS plugin that allows us to very easily change namespaces, and the CTX plugin that allows us to switch between contexts or clusters. So let's do another kubectl crew list, make sure these are actually installed. There we go. We've got CTX and we've got NS plugins. Now I'm going to clear my screen real quick. So one last thing we need to do for Crew to know what clusters we have available is we need to go back to that kubeconfig command or environment variable, and we're going to set it to both our prod cluster and our QA cluster. So let's go ahead and set that. And now if we do kubectl ctx, which was the name of that plugin that we installed, that didn't work because we need to do the source or shell again. Now let's try kubectl ctx. Now that's just pointing to QA. So let's see, what's our kubeconfig equal to? Interesting, it says it's just QA. So let's set kubeconfig again to prod and QA. Let's echo kubeconfig. There we go, that looks better. So now kubectl ctx. There we go. Now I've got my prod and my QA cluster. So if I select the QA cluster, you can see it change the context. And if I do kubectl get nodes, I'm looking at QA servers. Now let's switch to prod. We're now at prod, kubectl get nodes, and now we're pointing to our prod cluster. So kubectl ctx, very easy visual way for you to switch your contexts. The last thing I want to look at is the NS plugin that we installed that allows us to very easily work with namespaces. Now, one thing that I've found is kind of a pain is when you're working in one namespace and you're doing some investigation, some troubleshooting, and you have to constantly set the -n namespace parameter within kubectl. So for example, let's say we want to look into the kube system namespace. So if I want to get pods, for example, I need to specify -n kube system. All right, so here's all the pods. Now let's say I want to describe one of these pods. Well, I need to specify the pod name, so in this case core DNS, and I need to say -n kube system, right? So, you can think of all the different objects that you might want to interface with in a single namespace, and having to constantly put this -n kube system at the end can get annoying. So what we can do within kubectl, now that we've installed the crew NS plugin, is we could say kubectl ns, hit enter, and you can choose the namespace that you want to interface with. So right now we've set the active namespace to kube system. So if I do kubectl get pods, I don't need to specify -n kube system. It knows that I'm already in kube system, and I could do kubectl describe that pod again, but I don't need the -n kube system. So like I said, when I'm troubleshooting, I'm usually heavily in one single namespace, and it's just a pain to always have to put -n, the namespace name, afterwards. So using this new kubectl add-in called NS allows me to easily set my namespace so I don't have to keep repeatedly typing it. Hey everybody, this is Mike. Thanks so much for watching my video on kubectl and K3d. I hope you found the information useful. If you did, please go ahead and click that subscribe link. I promise there's going to be more videos coming.